Today, a seismic shift is brewing within the United Nations, as BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, advances an ambitious plan to reform the UN's veto power. For decades, the veto has been a tool wielded by the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, China, Russia, the United States, France, and the United Kingdom, to control the agenda on global issues. But now, BRICS is challenging this monopoly, aiming to dismantle a structure they argue serves Western interest at the expense of the wider world. In this video, we dive into the details of BRICS' bold move to transform the veto system, the reasons behind their push for reform, and the potential impacts on global power dynamics. Could this truly signal the end of Western dominance? Let's find out. To understand the gravity of BRICS' proposal, we need to take a closer look at the history of the UN and its veto structure. Established in 1945, the United Nations emerged from the ashes of World War II with a mission to maintain global peace and security. The Security Council, tasked with this responsibility, was structured to include 5 permanent members with veto power, each of whom had a significant role in winning the war. The idea was simple: to prevent global conflicts by granting veto powers to the most influential nations, enabling them to block any action they perceived as a threat to their interests. However, over time, this mechanism has been widely criticized. The veto power has frequently been used to block humanitarian interventions, halt resolutions on conflicts, and reinforce the interests of the P5, especially in areas like the Middle East. Critics argue that the veto no longer serves its original purpose, but instead reflects a power imbalance, as it often favors the geopolitical agendas of Western nations over the needs of the broader international community. BRICS has long championed the call for a more representative UN that reflects the realities of today's multipolar world. Collectively, BRICS represents around 40% of the world's population and accounts for nearly 25% of global GDP. Yet when it comes to decision-making at the highest level of the UN, they remain marginalized, with only China and Russia having permanent seats on the Security Council. The BRICS nations argue that the current structure is undemocratic and that the veto power limits the effectiveness of the UN by allowing a handful of countries to dictate outcomes. India, Brazil, and South Africa in particular have emphasized that the Security Council must expand to include permanent seats for countries from the global south. By reforming the veto system, BRICS aims to create a UN that is more inclusive and responsive to the needs of all member states, not just the powerful few. The recent BRICS summit discussions underscored this goal. Leaders of the bloc highlighted that a reformed UN would be better equipped to address pressing global issues such as climate change, poverty, and regional conflicts, areas often overshadowed by the political agendas of the P5. The BRICS proposal for reform involves several significant changes to the veto system. Here's a breakdown of their key suggestions. Expanding the Security Council. BRICS proposes adding more permanent seats to the Security Council, particularly for countries from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. This change would provide a broader representation of global perspectives and reduce Western dominance. Limiting the use of veto power. The BRICS bloc wants restrictions on the veto's use, such as requiring multiple nations to agree before a veto can be enacted. This would reduce instances where a single country can halt crucial decisions, allowing the Security Council to act more swiftly in response to crises. Creating an alternative mechanism for critical issues. BRICS suggests that issues related to humanitarian crises, climate change, and peacekeeping should be decided by the General Assembly rather than the Security Council. This would prevent a single veto from blocking resolutions on global emergencies and give greater voice to all member states. These changes would mark a fundamental shift in how the UN operates, potentially reducing Western influence and giving emerging economies and developing nations a stronger voice on the global stage. Predictably, Western nations, particularly the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, have pushed back against BRICS' calls for reform. For these countries, the veto power is not just a procedural tool, it's a mechanism that allows them to protect their national interests, alliances, and spheres of influence. Critics argue that removing or limiting the veto could make the UN less stable, as the P5 might be less inclined to participate actively if they feel their core interests are at risk. There is also concern that diluting the veto power could lead to inefficiencies, with more countries potentially making it harder to reach consensus on critical issues. However, in recent years, mounting frustration over the frequent use of vetoes, particularly in areas of humanitarian concern, has weakened Western nations' arguments. Even some European countries outside the P5 have begun to express support for reforms that would make the UN more accountable and representative. If BRICS succeeds in pushing through its proposed reforms, the implications for global governance could be profound. Increased global cooperation. A more representative Security Council could facilitate greater collaboration on issues like climate change, public health, and peacekeeping. By giving a voice to regions currently underrepresented, such as Africa and Latin America, the UN would become a more effective forum for addressing global challenges. A shift in power dynamics. Removing Western control over veto power would create a multipolar UN, where emerging powers like India and Brazil could influence decisions. This could lead to policies that are more inclusive and better aligned with the interests of the global South. Enhanced legitimacy and accountability. A reformed UN would likely enjoy greater credibility among its member states. As more countries feel represented, the organization would gain authority, making it a more powerful force for good in international relations. Reduced militarization of conflicts. With veto power constraints, the Security Council might adopt more peaceful resolutions, focusing on diplomacy over military intervention. This could lead to fewer unilateral actions by powerful states and encourage multilateral cooperation. These changes would undoubtedly transform the UN, potentially ushering in a new era of global governance where the voices of all countries, big and small, are heard. The BRICS proposal to reform the UN's veto system represents a bold challenge to the Western-controlled status quo. By pushing for a more inclusive Security Council and advocating for restrictions on veto power, BRICS is setting the stage for a new era of international relations, one that reflects the diversity and complexity of the modern world. This call for reform is not just about altering procedures, it's about shifting power to ensure that global decisions serve the interests of all. What do you think? Will BRICS' efforts to change the UN structure succeed, or will Western powers maintain their grip on the veto? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this analysis insightful, be sure to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more updates on the evolving landscape of global governance.